Now, our next presentation, we will share insights on finding and maintaining the working balance across departments at multi-attraction gardens. You'll hear from the Director of Horticulture at the Lincoln Park Zoo, Joe Rothleutner. You'll also hear from Landscape Curator at the Botanic Garden of Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, John Berryhill, as well as Head of Horticulture at the Filoli Center in Woodside, California, Jim Salyards. Now, to kick things off, please welcome Joe Rothleutner.
So first, I want to say welcome to everybody who's attending today, and thank you so much for coming to our session. It's really fun and exciting to be asked to re-showcase these presentations that we gave at the annual conference this past year. And I wanted to give a little bit of context on where this session really came from. So I was together with Jim and John actually at the Native Plant Symposium at Garden in the Woods. And while we're together, and when any group of colleagues kind of get together, I think you get to talk about the exciting things that you're working on, but you also start to think about, you talk about some of the challenges that you're facing that you think might be unique to your institution. But when you're talking amongst other people who work at kind of multi-attraction gardens, you start to realize that all of these places that are more than just a garden have challenges that have a lot of parallels, and they seem to have more in common than you might first think. So hopefully today we start to get you guys thinking about unique opportunities to help leverage some of those challenges you might have at your institution and bring in new creative ways to work on projects and build some of those internal collaborations. So today we're going to have 3 different talks. We have one that is myself presenting about my work here at the zoo. We have Jim Salyards from the Filoli Center, which is a historic estate and garden. And then John Berryhill from the Smith College, which is of course a university campus, but also a beautiful garden. So I'm going to start off by talking about the zoo. So to introduce you guys to the Lincoln Park Zoo, we just celebrated our 150th anniversary, and we're the 2nd oldest zoo in North America. Altogether, we're about 49 acres, and we're open to the public 365 days of the year. And because of our location in Chicago, we have a huge number of guests that come. We have almost 4 million visitors each year. And we're obviously known for having a large group of animals that live here, about 200 different types of animals, but we have over 1,400 different types of plants as well. And I mentioned that we're located in Chicago, and this is actually an aerial view of the parks where the zoo is located. And you can see the Chicago skyline in the background, Lake Michigan to the left. It's absolutely beautiful. But our mission is dedicated to connecting people from the city with nature by providing a free, family-oriented wildlife experience in the heart of Chicago, and by advancing the highest quality of animal care, education, science, and conservation. And we recently just went through a big new rebranding where we were starting to expand on that and trying to create a vision that can help us achieve that mission. And the vision that we came up with was to inspire communities to create environments where wildlife will thrive in our urbanizing world. And this is a shot again of the zoo, and this is Nature Boardwalk. It's our 14-acre prairie-style garden on the south end of the zoo. And it really embodies that vision of what we're trying to get cities and trying to get people started to do on any scale, from backyard gardens to hopefully inspiring park systems and other cities. So from there, I think it's interesting if we take a look back to where horticulture really was in the beginning of the zoo. So this is actually an old postcard from about 1920, and you can see they're beautiful gardens that are kind of running through the park and running through the zoo. But then if we look at another postcard from the 1920s, you can see that it's not quite as beautiful because we're looking at the animal exhibits now. So we're looking at where the animals are living, and it's not a habitat. It's not an environment. It's pretty stark, pretty barren. The animals are living on concrete. So it's not good for the animal welfare, and it's also not showcasing how these animals would behave in a natural system. So there's a lot of opportunity there for horticulture to start to work more closely with animal care and hopefully start to achieve some of those goals. So horticulture at a zoo, I think, is kind of based off of 4 pillars. So we have what we call our exhibit planting. So that would be an example of if we had some plants that were growing inside of those bare exhibits. We have our browse program, which is harvesting plant material that we feed out to the animals. We have kind of those formal gardens, like we saw the beautiful flowers from the other postcard in the 1920s, but then also our natural areas like Nature Boardwalk. And all of these go to help support different components that link back to the mission, but also just to that vision of inspiring communities. And some of those are animal welfare, our guest experience, habitat for visiting wildlife, our conservation initiatives, and then also learning outcomes. So if we take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of those exhibit plantings, I think it really hits on animal welfare, guest experience, and learning outcomes. So in a modern zoo, some of the exhibit goals would be to have beautiful, lush habitats where the animals have choice and they have the ability to interact with their environment. Kind of similar to Don was talking about how important it is for people to engage with nature and the wild systems. We also want our animals to be doing that because it's taking their basic care beyond what we call welfare. So like care would be making sure the animals have their food and their water. But welfare is the animals are perceived as being happy. They have choices. They're interacting with a dynamic system. And so this is our Japanese macaque exhibit. It's beautiful, it's lush, it's well balanced where the animals actually have opportunities where they're out there foraging, very similar to the way they would in nature. And recently, we just opened a new exhibit, the Walter Family Arctic Tundra, with our new polar bears, Siku and Tellini. And so this was an original rendering showing this lush system where the animals, again, had free choice. They're able to interact with the environment, going up on rocks, climbing, digging in soft substrates and dirt, and behaving much the way they would on a tundra. And it actually was realized. It was beautiful when it first opened. Again, we have the beautiful plant materials there to help support the natural behaviors of the animals. And we actually pulled some of those plant materials out to meet the public to help with some of those learning outcomes so people could also interact with the environment similarly to the way they might see the polar bears. They could touch some of the grasses, they could smell the flowers, and be engaged with the animal through the habitat. But as soon as we introduced our wonderful polar bears, Siku and Tellini, we started to have some challenges with the exhibit. So first off, Siku, our male polar bear, he immediately went for a lot of the shrubs that were planted in the exhibit. This is one of the Arctic willows that he took down to his pool, threw it in the water, was treating it like a toy. It was great enrichment and it was a great opportunity for him to interact with the environment, but it wasn't the exact outcome we were really hoping for. And Tellini, I don't know if you see her in this photo, that is Siku to the right, but Tellini is actually right there digging in a mud pit. So she has created herself a little wallow, taking a nap out on exhibit. And it's great for her. She's really enjoying the habitat. She's doing things that she would choose to do in nature. But it has destabilized quite a bit of the exhibit now that we've lost some of those plant materials that were really holding the soil in place and were preventing erosion. So this might be a little bit difficult to perceive, but this is actually a relatively steep slope. And because of the way the water drains in the exhibit, it's been moving down this hill into their pool. And that pool should be clear water where you can see the polar bears if they're in there swimming. But because so much sediment has moved down into the pool, it's kind of obscured the vision of the polar bears while they're in the water, but also it's challenging for the engineering of the system to actually be able to filter that water and keep it clean without needing constant maintenance. And it's also been incredibly taxing on the keepers as we've had to drop the pool and replace the water. They're in there with shovels, literally pulling mud out of the bottom of the pool. And this is all a challenge for the maintenance of the exhibit, but also really the perception of the public and the donors to help support it. People will come and they'll see this, I'm going to say, I'm putting up air quotes, dirty water. And it just doesn't look good for the animals. It doesn't look like they're getting the best care that they could. So we needed to address this. We needed to figure out a way to improve the water quality. Even though the polar bears were incredibly happy through this whole experience, it was really that perception that they weren't getting the full care that they needed. So we came up with a short-term fix where our horticulture team went in with some muscle and some buckets, and we were literally scooping and pulling the dirt all the way back up to the top of the exhibit, trying to restabilize the slope the best we could with some live stakes of willow, some live stakes of different brambles, and we were trying to figure out a way to get vegetation reestablished in the exhibit. And it worked somewhat. And again, it was kind of a short-term fix because as soon as we went into our winter and we lost the growing season, some of those plant materials weren't able to keep up with, again, that erosion and keep up with the foot traffic from the bears. So that's been our short-term fix for the time being. And the medium fix, or the kind of somewhat long-term fix, might also be a step backwards, because we've been thinking and talking about, well, how can we find a solution to this erosion problem? Should we go in with more gunite or rock work, similar to the old saddle exhibit that's shown in this photo? But that's really a step backwards for us, because we wanted to have this dynamic environment where there were soft substrates that the bears could dig, they could walk, they could feel, and again, feel like they're more in nature. And just having a concrete rock work isn't really going to give those bears that same experience. So that's not what we're going to be able to do. We need to find a longer term solution that's really going to work for us. And part of where I think we're going and where we're finding that longer term solution is really by looking at internal collaborations in the zoo. So horticulture used to be based in operations, which operations for us is our facilities team, our cleaning fanatics, and it's our group that really works on supporting the zoo on an as-needed basis. But the bubbles that are in blue are conservation and science, animal care, and learning and community engagement. And those together we call zoo programs. So those are really the mission-based components or departments at the zoo. And because horticulture was in an operational stance, we weren't really coming in and advising much or helping before a problem arose. But with a little bit of thinking and tinkering and restructuring, we were able to find a deeper level of collaboration and create a cultural shift by moving horticulture from the operational pillar of the zoo over into that zoo programs component by working closer together with animal care. But then that also brought in collaborations with learning and community engagement and conservation and science. And so to take a little bit of a closer look at that and where this is going is we're getting ready to do a new exhibit overhaul at our Lion House. And so our Lion House is one of our historic buildings from 1911, and it's right in the core, the center of the zoo. And we're really looking at animal care and horticulture, really bringing in components for animal welfare, the function of those exhibit spaces, but also exhibit maintenance on the horticulture end, and aesthetics. We're bringing in our conservation and science team to really work on figuring out what messaging we can have in connection to work that's happening out in the field or happening out in Africa with some of our collaborations. But then also the learning and community engagement team is coming to the table and really working on building interpretive elements into that exhibit design that's going to help tell a better story about how we care for the animals that live here at the zoo. It's really an exciting time and an exciting opportunity to really be there at the beginning of a project and be able to give input that will hopefully make it more successful right off the bat and not need as many modifications. But to share some of these other collaborations that have kind of emerged out of this, this new mindset and a new way of working is that we're working a lot closer with the animal keepers themselves. And this was kind of, it started as like a social activity where we had some juice and some cookies, and we actually put together an herb garden in one of the auxiliary spaces behind our ape house. So you might be able to see there's a couple of chimpanzees watching us as we're teaching the keepers how to harvest herbs and how to plant and care for the herbs that are going to be picked and given back to those apes and primates to help enrich their daily experiences. They're foraging through their exhibit, they find something that's spicy or find something that smells really good to help improve their day-to-day. Other collaborations that have kind of emerged have been working really closely with our nutrition center at the zoo, where we process and prepare the food that goes out to those animals. And one of that was that horticulture came in and we helped advise on a post-harvest storage study on bamboo. So we order our bamboo in from other locations because we weren't able to grow enough to feed our red pandas. And as we get that, we get these huge boxes, and we need to figure out a way that we can store that bamboo most effectively. So you can see on the far left, that was a bamboo that didn't fare so well through one of the trials, but the ones on the right are much more lush and look much more palatable. Another thing was that we got browse prescribed into our gorillas' diets. So browse is, again, it's something that we feed out to the animals to enrich their day. So they're already getting their sweet potatoes and their lettuce and all the other types of things that they're getting from the nutrition center. But browse is something that we're cutting off of zoo grounds to go into their exhibit for them to forage and eat in a much more natural way. It's got more fiber, more minerals, and different nutrients in it that might not be available in some of those domesticated vegetables. And so with the gorillas, for example, we set a specific amount of browse that we were going to harvest from certain species and deliver it weekly so that we could cut back on feeding some of the lettuce. And it was incredible. You could see that the gorillas were truly enjoying what they were doing as they were out there foraging in their exhibits, but also we were able to save a lot of money. We cut back almost $8,000 in lettuce in just 1 year. So that's pretty incredible. Some collaborations that have emerged again out of this is also that we've been working closely with our marketing communications team to help tell some of those stories. So we had this beautiful article that was in our Zoo magazine that went out to our members, telling the story of where browse comes from and how it impacts the animals. Other collaborations that have emerged have been with our facilities team. We have this really nice kind of booklet that we have that we call our Zoo Landscape Standards. And it really defines materials for fencing, hardscape, trash cans, benches. And by doing this, it's really given the zoo a much more uniform appearance as we're going through construction projects and we're redoing spaces. We're making it feel more and more like the zoo is unified. And this goes a long way for guest perception because they see an identity of the zoo when they are here, and you take a picture and you see the fence, you know that, hey, I've seen that fence before, it's at Lincoln Park Zoo, instead of having each area kind of themed differently. I think it's really had an impact. Another example is, again, this is the Walter family Arctic Tundra photo, and you see that fence that's kind of running through the middle of that garden space. It's kind of hard to see because there's plants on both sides of it. But we've actually used that same style of fencing for some of our different events. So here we've made stanchions out of it for one of our food truck socials. So this is, again, just kind of repurposing and reusing consistent materials. So that way we have a more unified vision and more unified look and feel of the zoo. And so that might have been a little bit all over the place towards the end, but I think it's just when you really start to think creatively about the different opportunities that are there to work with different departments, it really can help strengthen the image and strengthen the work that everybody's already doing. So thank you so much. My email's here. I think we're going to take questions at the end, but I would like to pass over the power to Jim Salyards from Filoli. And Jim is going to talk to you guys a little bit more about what he's doing. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, the marketing community, for putting together this webinar. I think it's really fun to have an opportunity to share all these different presentations with a broader audience than those folks who can make it to the annual meetings each year. And as Joe said, we really did try to bring together a group of panelists for the session representing different institutions, just so people could be thinking about, not only how does horticulture engage with other aspects of the institution, but, be thinking about how, your other departments can engage with each other, marketing development, visitor services and marketing, all those different ways that we can work together to better our institution. So Filoli has actually just gone through a new strategic planning process, and in the midst of that has revised our mission statement. And we're really about telling, the history of this place through the beauty and nature and the shared stories that we impart to our guests when they're here. And just to kind of give some context about Filoli, it starts out with the two families who were a part of building this place, beginning with the Bourne family, who were the groundbreakers of Filoli. Their principal source of wealth was the Empire Gold Mine in Grass Valley up in the Sierra foothills. Mr. Bourne was president of the Spring Valley Water Company. And Mr. Bourne attended Cambridge University and really wanted to create a country place estate that was reminiscent of what he was seeing on the English countryside. I think that they did that. They were really, as you can see there in the quote by Mr. Bourne, we're hoping to spend the latter part of their years just growing and growing young as they stroll the grounds at Filoli. The Bournes both passed in 1936, and then the property was bought by the Roth family, whose principal source of wealth was the Matson Navigation Company, big shipping company that was all over the Pacific, including cruise lines. And it was under the Ross that the gardens really started to gain worldwide recognition. And one of the incredible things about the Ross was that they were such incredible stewards of the property. They really didn't change it much, and kind of kept that historic look that the BOURNS established. In 1975, the property was donated to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the National Trust is all about saving historic places. Failoli is one of their 27 sites, and represents, you know, as I said, a country place estate in California. If you look at Failoli, we're really broken up into three pieces, starting with the house. This modified Georgian house is 54,000 square feet, many rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms, and extensive libraries as well. And we have a collection that that represents both the families who are here, but also many other things that have been added over the years from donors, including one big donation that came in the late 90s, which was, you know, really perfect for a place like Failoli, representing 17th and 18th century English and Irish furniture and decorative pieces. But we really are focused on preservation throughout the estate, but particularly in the house. It requires a lot of focus on the pieces and all the ways that we can keep the house looking as vibrant as it did during the time that the families were here. The second part of the property, of course, is the garden, which has really brought Failoli a lot of renown. We have extensive spring displays, but also do beautiful summer displays. But the garden really has an incredible design and foundation with a mile of hedge, turf throughout the garden as well, that give it that country place look. And we feel that Failoli is one of the most beautiful gardens in the world. And that's what we're told, you know, as people stroll through. The garden is broken up into different garden rooms that kind of give gives you a sense of enclosure, but also allows you to take in each of those spaces as you navigate through the garden. And then the third piece is the land. We sit on 654 acres with 6 distinct ecosystems and many miles of trails around the property, and many deer and other critters around the property as well. Pumas come through the garden occasionally, mountain foxes, coyotes, all sorts of things call Failoli home. And we're also bisected by the San Andreas Fault. And that helps us to tell, another story about this land that we sit on. So I've broken my talk up into 3 case studies of where horticulture has engaged with other aspects of the institution. And I first want to start with flowers. Flowers were an incredibly important part of both families who were here. Both the BOURNS and the Roths were members of the Garden Club of America. And today we still maintain cutting gardens and have greenhouses with collections that are used in the house. And you can see here in some historic photos orchids and flower arrangements that were really important part of the decor in the homes. And we have these historic greenhouses and still maintain cutting gardens, and so that tradition is something that we want to continue, even though for many museums bringing live plants in is a challenge and can be very damaging, but we are always looking at ways we can grow and do a better job at that. So it's a little bit what I want to talk about. We continue with our houseplant tradition. We have collections that represent both the families and then many plants that we've added since Failoli became part of the National Trust in 1975. But we're always looking at ways we can be more precautious and careful, protecting furniture with glass and monitoring for pests. And then moving on to flowers, flower arrangements were a huge part of particularly the Roth era and some of the things that they did during the parties that they held. And that continues today. We do about 25 arrangements throughout the house and some of the other buildings on site. And we have a committee of 90 flower arranging and floral design volunteers who do those arrangements. But you know, in the last 10 years, we've really focused on ways we can protect the house with plastic sheeting that goes down, towels around on top of furniture to protect it, to keep, you know, things from being ground into the wood and into the walls. But we have to be really vigilant in terms of communicating with our volunteers who do these arrangements. You know, you can't leave your watering can on your 300-year-old rug. You don't want that to spill and damage not only the rug but the floor and potentially the furniture as well. Flowers can't be leaning on important antiques in the house. So those communications are really critical to preserving our collections. And horticulture is also responsible and accountable for being careful, learning what plants are damaging in the house and removing those from the palette of things that we grow for cutting, and picking things at certain times of the year when we know that they're not going to be dropping fruits. You know, Nandina fruits when they're ripe are going to fall and get crushed into rugs. But when you are picking them when they're still green and have a little color, then, you know, that's the perfect time, and you're not going to be dropping fruit on furniture and rugs. Green waste is an important part of that, what we can do to protect things, removing it as soon as possible so that insects don't build up populations in buckets of green material. These also will elevate the humidity, which can affect furniture and books and tapestries and things. So regularly dumping our green waste is important. And then staying educated on other protective measures that we can implement so that we're protecting the house. Just as a quick aside, one of the fun things that we've added in the last couple of years is doing identifications of our arrangements. It's something that we have for our docents. We have it at the front door of the house so that when guests are asking what are in the arrangements, we have a list ready for them. And it's really helped to better engage the visitors with our floral program, you know, because they're interested in the plants, because all of the material comes from the garden. And then moving on to just ways we can protect the house. In other ways, we had many events that really were damaging to the house. Here you can see the ballroom. This is what the ballroom looks like clean, and this is what it looks like when you lay sod on the floor and have trees and plants all over. We have also, with holiday events, transformed rooms from this to this with, you know, pounds and pounds of glitter that gets ground into walls and curtains and floors. So we've really worked at significantly changing our events so that they're more protective of the house, including completely revamping our holiday event, so that we're not causing regular damage, moving furniture and bumping into walls with merchandise as it's coming and going, and being much more mindful of the preservation of the house. But that doesn't mean we're not adding things and showcasing horticulture where we can and where we can do it in a way that makes more sense, like having an orchid show in the kitchen, in the foyer of the house where there aren't a lot of decorative pieces. And we hope to do more of that in the future so that we're reinforcing the importance of plants and flowers, but doing it in a way that is not damaging to the house. My next case study is on retail. We have a store at Filoli, the Clock Tower shop, and horticulture works with retail in developing products for sale because guests are really enthused about taking home things that are pieces of the garden. So we actually will create products from debris from the garden. These are pear and apple twigs that are bundled up into fire starters. We harvest our lavender from our historic lavender garden and sell that as sachets. The people really love lavender and love bringing home something like that from the gardens at Filoli. We have intentional products like herbs and vinegars that we make from herbs that are grown on site. Filoli is known for its fruit collection. It's our largest total collection of of plants, and it is an eclectic collection of all sorts of things. And so we've been looking lately at ways we can use the fruit collection to produce products for the store. And we've been doing jams the last 5 years with apples and pears, and doing single varieties and mixed varieties. People really are interested in, knowing that an apple butter is made from all Spitzenberg apples or all Comis pear. It helps to engage them in this collection that we have, and have a tasty product that they can bring home. And this year we'll be debuting our first hard cider. We worked with a local cidery and sent up over 2 tons of fruit. So I'm really excited about doing something more with our fruit. And the final story is on events. It's definitely a new era at Filoli, having private events. This was our stance in the past. Keep off the lawns, don't touch the plants. But this place was created for entertaining. That's what the families did here, and to carry on that tradition, and also to bring new audiences. We've really worked at creating a really dynamic events program here in the last few years, turning our lawns where we used to say keep off into beautiful wedding reception venues, and using these beautiful buildings that we have, and allowing people to have dinners and enjoy these beautiful rooms and things around the property. But one of the keys was developing a really good property use guidelines documents that we could share with people, and it goes detailed in a detailed way into capacity for spaces and what's allowed, where red wine is allowed, where it's not allowed, and other precautions in terms of setups that help to protect the garden. But there have been some hiccups. Bricks have been chipped, and now we know that that's something we need to add to the discussion with these vendors that we have. We've had events set up, and a lot of it is just about communication. This was a painting event that was on the calendar for a while, but wasn't something we were paying attention to, and ended up working toward renovating this lawn days before this happened. So just working together collaboratively with the events team has helped us prevent situations like this. We had Ferrari doing a party at Filoli, and we were very careful working with them, bringing their car into the middle of the garden. But we didn't realize, even though we used protective measures, bringing the car in, that those pads that they had to use to move the car along, as the car sat and we moved the pad along, the very low car was on top of the lawn, burning the lawn. So, you never know what situations can come up, but with each one you learn and hopefully do a better job. And ultimately, the great thing about the events is that we have a lot of new and satisfied customers, team building sessions that are going at Filoli, bringing tech people to Filoli, potting up plants, kind of engaging with what we are all about, and learning about a place that they didn't even know was in their backyard. It's really been a wonderful new adventure for all of us, but having happy audiences is what we're all about. When you can enjoy the pool at Filoli and have a party, it's a lifelong memory. And hopefully Filoli stays with these folks for the rest of their lives. Thank you. And now I want to turn it over to John Berryhill from Smith College.
All right, thank you, Jim. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear, John.
Great. Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Joe and Jim. And greetings, everybody, from the Botanic Garden of Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. As Gabby had said earlier, I'm the landscape curator here. I'm part of a team of 15 people that manage our facilities and our engagement and outreach efforts with our stakeholders. The facilities here include the Lyman Conservatory, an exhibit gallery there. We have 3 main gardens on campus and several small named gardens spread throughout the campus, and an accessioned arboretum that is comprised of all the trees and landscape plantings on campus. It's probably worth noting, too, that Smith College has a separate grounds department with an entirely separate reporting line, and they handle lawn maintenance, non-accessioned natural areas, and aspects of landscape stewardship that don't really fit better under their objectives and mission than they do under ours. But before I really get rolling here, I wanted to say that I feel obliged to start off by thanking Joe for inviting Jim and I to examine our gardens through this lens. When he first reached out to us with the idea for this presentation, to explore these common threads that run through our respective institutions that might seem very like an eclectic group at first. It gave me reason for the first time really to reflect on the fact that the intersection of knowledge and stories from the plant world and knowledge and stories from beyond the plant world were really at the heart of our identity as a botanic garden. And that gives us a really natural home at a modern liberal arts institution like Smith College. And it also really struck me that the ideas and motivation for the 2 garden spaces that I want to highlight today, ones that we're really proud of, originated not just outside of our department, but outside of the plant world altogether, as did the idea for our existence as a botanic garden that's thoroughly woven into a college landscape in the first place. For anyone who doesn't know, Smith College is a small women's liberal arts college in the Connecticut River Valley, Massachusetts, and near the downtown Northampton. It has about 2,500 undergraduate students, a couple of small graduate programs. The graduate program's co-ed, and it's on about a 125-acre campus. And the Botanic Garden here was really infused into the college's DNA from its inception, creating a really fertile ground for the kind of symbiosis and co-ownership of both mission and physical space that all 3 of us are talking about today. And after a really successful first decade in the 1880s, the need for growth and the development of campus infrastructure became apparent. And it was towards the end of the 19th century that our first president, Lawrence Clark Seeley's idea for the campus to not just contain a botanic garden, but for the entire campus landscape to be one, was born. And he was able to bring in 2 heavyweights at the time, the Olmsted firm from New York to handle the landscape architecture, and botanist William Francis Genong to teach and to ensure that the scientific value of the collection and the teaching that was coming from it was going to meet his goals. And together, those 3 planned out and planted literally the concept that's the foundation of what we still are today. It's worth noting that Genong wrote that it was his belief at the time that President Seeley's concept of integration was a truly original one, and I haven't heard of him of being proven wrong on that point at this time. So I've been here for 22 years at the college and worn many different hats in that time, an arboriculture, wildflower gardener, and in that 2+ decades, I've seen the contraction of the presence of classical botany within the biology department at Smith that has coincided with a national and perhaps even international trend. But that does not mean a loss of love for plants with our students, or nationally or internationally. And I feel that what we have lost in the depth of that specific value to our botany professors and students, we've more than gained in the breadth of engagements with and values to other academic departments. And I'd also add another bullet point to what I have up on this slide here, that we are just wrapping up our first ever strategic planning process that'll give us a 5-year roadmap that is firmly grounded in the goals and priorities that the college has highlighted in its broader strategic plan, and that will put really complex problems like inclusion and equity and access for those who have not always felt like our resources were here for them very much on the front burner for us. And I know that we're not the only ones who are hoping that like projects like that, we're not the only ones working on projects like that, and we're hoping that this will, the ideas that come out of that work will put us ahead of a very important curve and help us reimagine our institutional identity as one that embodies inclusion and equity and access for all. So as I segue into the 2 garden spaces I want to talk about today, I'll point out that neither of these 2 would be considered one of our main flagship gardens, but unlike those bigger gardens that look more like our roots, these 2 spaces look a lot more like where we're headed, like our apical meristems, to make the botanical metaphor keep going. But anyways, in 2013, what might euphemistically be described as an unremarkable corner of our science quad was converted into a garden and geological exhibit that we now call our rock park. That what you see up on the screen is a pamphlet that was created by a student advertising and explaining and interpreting some of the rocks there. The installation of it was part of a project to redesign and improve a larger area, including a courtyard between 2 science buildings. It is a curated rock exhibit. It is a accessioned garden showcasing native flora. It's a beautiful example of a Smith alum's professional success. We hired Nancy Denning from the class of 1968 at Smith. She's a local landscape architect to do the project design here. And there's a perfectly situated piece of sculpted stone art that not only beautifies the space, but it was designed to reflect a mathematical theorem. And all of this is in a space that invites visitors to pause and find some restorative energy and inspiration or emotional well-being in the midst of a busy and potentially stressful academic environment there. The concept for the rock park originated with geology professor John Brady, who you see pictured on the right, speaking with Nancy Denning, who was the designer of the space. And John's been a fantastic ally to us at the Botanic Garden for a real long time now. And when I was talking to him about how this all came to be, he was saying in the late 1970s, he brought his very first geology class out into our rock garden, not our rock park. He was the stones that we have worked into that landscape. He was hopping around on them to use them as teaching tools for his class, and I'm sure this audience would appreciate or understand the next thing that's going to happen when you do that is the horticulture staff's going to say that the delicate alpine flora in such a garden is not going to appreciate that type of visitorship. So he was asked to not be hopping around on the rocks. So from that experience, he came up with the idea of this curated rock exhibit that could be incorporated into the campus landscape in an aesthetically pleasing way. And I have to say, I'm sort of shocked and maybe a bit grateful in a way that his idea didn't come to fruition sooner, because it's really easy for me to imagine that a less valuable version of this project could have been easily created and cheaply created if the goal was simply to scratch the itch for the geology department. It's a relatively new garden, so a lot is working well. Perhaps that's why we haven't run into any snags, but there's a lot to love here. It's by far the nicest example of that classic yin and yang garden aesthetic of the harder shapes and colors and textures of the stone playing with the organic qualities of the plants. You saw all the list of sort of layers of value that I listed on the last slide. All of that in an area half the size of a tennis court really packs a lot of punch in an area that used to be, as I said, kind of visually unpleasing. And I don't know if patience is the right word for what allowed this project to become what it was. It might have been just John Brady running into a lot of bureaucratic and financial red tape to make it happen. But whatever the reason, I'm sort of glad that it came together the way it did, because it as I said before, it's easy to imagine this project not having all the layers of value that it does. And then the last point here was this quote came when I was talking with John Brady about the project, and it really just rang in my head as like, wow, this is really what we're talking about here. If you could distill Jim's and Joe's and my presentations down into one sentence, perhaps this would be it. That projects like these invite us to be advocates for each other's priorities. When it's done well, this is beautiful. This is really, really good. So my next example has been around a little bit longer. Our Japanese garden really has an ideal setting. It's on a woodland slope along the edge of a dammed up portion of the Mill River. It feels secluded enough to have the kind of energy that you would want this kind of garden to have, but it is also very close to and accessible from the core areas of campus, including our Botanic Garden headquarters. And like the Rock Park, this garden started with a professor seeing the potential in the Botanic Garden as a platform to express and celebrate what was being taught in the classroom. Professor Tai Uno, who taught East Asian, I think still does teach East Asian Studies and religion, was able to rally support from his department as well as the president of the college at the time and get funding to bring in a premier Japanese garden designer, David Slauson, a name perhaps some will recognize. And for almost 2 decades, the garden matured and really served its purpose well. However, the budget tightening that followed the economic downturn in 2001 resulted in some departmental reorganization and realignment and shuffling of responsibilities in both our department and in facilities management and in the grounds department, both of whom played a role in maintaining the hardscape and the structures down there, as well as some of the landscape stewardship. And the unfortunate result was that the garden didn't really have a designated caretaker and over time, the condition of that space started to very slowly deteriorate for almost a decade or so. And fortunately, those entities that had felt co-ownership with this garden in East Asian Studies, in religion, and by this time, our landscape studies department had been born and was starting to gain momentum, and they became vocal advocates for bringing the garden back to its original condition and demanded that the space be restored and honored the way it should be. The president, our current president, was happy to oblige, and sorry, something popped up on my screen. I don't know if that's you've seen that. Anyways, the president freed up the funding to bring in John Powell, who was a trusted colleague of David Slauson, to breathe some life back into the garden. And we asked our chief gardener, Nate Sachs, to ensure that the space had sufficient attention to really thrive. So there is a really happy ending there, but I think it's worth noting the obvious lesson/warning here that when we're co-owning projects and spaces and mission with other departments or entities, good communication is always going to be a really critical ingredient to any successful collaboration. I was not part of any conversations that would have been happening at the time when things were going downhill with the Japanese garden, but I'd like to assume that they were really good ones, and I do assume they were, but it's easy to imagine that if they were not, that we would run a real risk of coming across as being bad partners, and that would be really unfortunate and could stand in the way of future collaborations. So lastly, just to summarize, I hope these examples of how, or illustrate my point, that an institutional identity that's really centered on inclusion and intersections is really who we are and who we want to continue to be. And it's going to be really exciting to explore and identify like never before the most valuable connections that we can make both within our Smith ecosystem and beyond it. Some of those connections are going to look like very intuitive fits, like landscape studies, for example. I think there's a lot of room for us to connect there. But other ones where institutions like ours don't really have that time-tested roadmap to follow. Although I say that with my hat tipped enthusiastically to Don Rakow, who is creating a fantastic roadmap with exactly this kind of new territory for us to follow. The work that he and his colleagues are doing is really inspiring and impressive. But we look forward to exploring that space with courage and with a strong sense of purpose. And it would not surprise me if, as we do that, our most innovative and important ideas once again come from outside partners who suggest projects that, to quote John Brady, invite us to be advocates for each other's priorities. So thank you all for listening. I'll pass it back to either Abby or Joe if there's any questions people want to direct to our group. And thank you, APGA, for letting us give this presentation.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jim and Joe, as well. Our first question comes from Sherry, and this is for Jim at Fioli. How many acres of Fioli are open to tourists, and how much is formally developed?
Probably about 30 of the total 654 acres are open. There's 16 acres of formal gardens, and then another 7-acre orchard that's open for guided tours during the fruit season, and then probably another, so maybe my numbers are off, but maybe another 40 acres where we have trails running through. And of that, as I said earlier, there are 7 acres of trails that we've developed, including 7 miles of trails and 1 mile of self-guided trails.
Okay, thank you for that. And a follow-up question for you, Jim. Now, in terms of the new audiences and new events that you are bringing into the center, have you had any pushback from stakeholders or had any resistance to that change? And how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's mostly been some of our volunteer community, unfortunately, who, we're seeing people who, of all stripes that they weren't used to seeing in this kind of more conservative sort of a garden, a little old world, white collar sort of a place formally. But our stance has been Fioli is open to everyone, and we don't entertain those sorts of criticisms when they're seeing families and people of different stripes that they're not used to seeing here. It's just been a zero tolerance for that sort of commentary. Has really been our approach.
Great, thank you for sharing that insight. Another question we have, and this I can throw to Joe at Lincoln Park Zoo. How have you kept those who work across departments actively engaged with the work and efforts of other departments, especially after a specific task or project has been completed?
That's a really good question, and I think it goes a lot of different directions. So one of the things that's kind of small is just making sure that you have standing meetings with people from some of those different departments that are some of the key stakeholders. And even if it doesn't seem like you have some of the big updates or a big project necessarily coming down the line, make sure you still get together, make sure you still have that FaceTime, because sometimes it's casual conversation that'll bring forward a potential issue or bring forward new opportunities. So I think that's important on kind of a smaller scale. Make sure you have those meetings going, but then also the leadership at the zoo, they've been really thoughtful with building kind of, I mentioned that team called Zoo Programs, where it's the three really mission-based departments: animal care and horticulture, learning and community engagement, and science and conservation, making sure that they have regular monthly meetings, bringing together all of those directors and managers to make sure that, again, we're aligned, we're thinking creatively about those new opportunities. And I think that kind of helps answer some of those. But if John or Jim have other ideas, they can pop in as well.
Actually, this is John, and I have a quick thought that pertains to that. We're a mix of unionized and non-unionized staff, and as our goals have evolved and we've gotten a lot of wonderful fresh faces here at the Botanic Garden, one thing that we found has helped is our job descriptions used to be, especially the union ones, used to be look like task lists, and I think that had the unintended effect of narrowing the scope of the jobs and not really placing them in the context of the Botanic Garden's mission. They looked like, some gardener's job might be, deadhead perennials, pull weeds, edge beds, and now 90% of the job description is really mission-oriented, not task-oriented. And so what really pops when you read those job descriptions is your place in the bigger picture. That's allowed us to attract the right people with the right attitude from the start, and been a big difference in terms of our ability to sort of collaborate and be a flexible department.
And this is Jim. I'll also chime in. One of our successes in the last few years has been having a good leader who really has focused on communication and how important that is to running, keeping the ship going forward and on a smooth course. So as Joe mentioned, having monthly meetings with senior leadership has really been a key part of that, and all of us knowing what's going on in each other's departments and what some of the broader conversations are, and participating in those. But we also have weekly operations meetings where all of those folks who pretty much every department is represented, and knowing what things are going on in terms of projects, events, just so that we have that opportunity to ask the questions so that each of these activities goes off without a hitch. It's really all comes down to communication.
Yeah, great questions. And it definitely sounds like communications is key. So thank you for those points. Another question for Jim. How do you decide what retail products will best resonate with guests and help them bring their Fioli experience home? Is that a cross-department process as well?
Really mostly falls under the retail team. I work with them in terms of products that represent the fruit collection. And then under horticulture, we have a group of volunteers who are actually making these lavender sachets and bundles of apple and pear twigs for fire starters and things like that. But they're regularly assessing how well things are selling, and the staff and the volunteers who work in the store are listening to the commentary. But I think it's, the proof is in what's selling well and what's not. And so if a product, a vinegar flavor is not selling well, then we downsize and we sell, we focus on the things that are the hot products, that is always evolving with trends, but just paying attention to what's selling well and what the customers respond the most to is kind of how we decide what to keep selling and what we stop selling.
Great, thanks for that insight into the retail side. Our next question, this is from Brandon, and this is kind of back to our past discussion about working with other departments, and this is for John. How were you able to work with unions to change the job descriptions that would kind of resonate with them?
Well, I guess the simple answer is we just had to go ahead and do it. I think it starts there. Joe and Jim talked about the importance of a consistent message from the top and through middle management, whatever that might look like at your institution, and that everybody's sort of whistling the same tune. But not to say it didn't. It does have the potential to ruffle feathers, and it might mean somebody bidding out of your department if your union structure set up in a way that can happen. But it really did let us get to the point where we could ensure we were having the right people for the right job. You've got to be obviously doing that. Sometimes you're realizing that you're changing somebody's career and asking them to decide, is this what they want to do. Still, it's very impactful for an individual, and you want to be sensitive to that. But I would encourage people to go ahead and do it. I mean, if you understand what your mission is and your job descriptions are, for a fact they're set up poorly to achieve those goals. That's step number one right there, is just to go ahead and do that. If you want to reach out to me, an email, I could give you a sense of, I think I should make sure I'm allowed to share these, but like what an example of one of our old job descriptions, the more task-oriented ones looked like versus our more mission-oriented ones. If you want to contact me via email, if you don't have it, it's Berryhill, my last name without the L's, at smith.edu. If you can't remember that or write that down, you can reach me through the Botanic Gardens website easily enough. I'd be happy to continue that conversation.
I'd like to actually hop in and not that we, as our horticulture staff, is we're non-union, but we were having trouble with recruiting some of our seasonal gardeners to the team. And one of the things we did, it seems like a small change while we were redoing the job descriptions, but we changed the title from, I think it was landscape laborer to seasonal gardener. And just by doing that, we saw a big shift in the number of applicants, but then also the strength of those individual applicants and their interest in really doing hands-on applied horticulture. So I thought that was really interesting as well.
That's a good point. I think we gave a lot of thought to job titles as well, wanting them to matter and understand that they do matter. I didn't even think about that in terms of what your talent pool you could attract would look like, but that's a really good point, Joe.
Great. Our next question comes from Thomas. He is from Ohio, from Holden Forests and Gardens. He says, in engaging the community with programming in a public shared space that lies within an urban business district, we see an opportunity to collaborate with the local venues. I love the concept of being advocates for other people's priorities. I hope to schedule the park as an outdoor space for meetings and programs for the wellness of the business staff. Any other suggestions drawing from that cross-departmental mentality that could translate on this scale? It's a big question.
It is.
This is Jim. I'll take a stab at a piece of it, and I think this is where Thomas is going, which is, I think just opening your doors to new ways of using the institution really does bring in new audiences and helps to build your visitation as an outcome of that. We're being discovered by the tech industry and having allowing folks to have retreats here, and I showed the photos of the succulent potting activity, but offering other activities as part of being the venue, like potting or tours of the institution. This can be a retreat and a time for them to be doing something business related, but also giving them that bit of escape and helping to start to build that relationship with these individuals really pays dividends. And you have people coming back, going back to their institution and asking if they can do a corporate work day at the institution, or we have people coming back with their families and becoming members. So the dividends of opening up the institution really are huge.
I'll add to that a little bit too. So Jim mentioned it, but those corporate work days. So that's one thing that we found a lot of success with here at the zoo. Because of our location, again, we're kind of in the heart of Chicago. Our development team and corporate alliances, they have really strong relationships with a lot of different organizations where they are donating to the zoo, and kind of a benefit that they get as a corporation of donating and supporting the zoo is these corporate work days where they actually come out and they work with the horticulture team. And sometimes we have them down at Nature Boardwalk doing kind of spring cleanup of the prairie, both for litter, but then also vegetation. So we just kind of get the old debris out of the way so that the new season can grow. But then we've also really leaned on them as kind of being some pretty strong muscle when we have a bigger project where we're moving soil or moving rocks. And they get a lot of joy out of it because sometimes they're going in the animal exhibits, they're really connecting with the mission and the space. And like Jim said, then you kind of get these people returning, they're excited about it every year. And it's a win-win.
Great, thank you, Thomas, for that question and to get some brainstorming going on to further this topic. Thomas says, very valuable suggestions. So happy to hear the retreat concept along with the integration of board members and corporate relationships. So thank you all for your recommendations. That is all the time we have for this session. Once again, I'd like to thank Jim, Joe, and John. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you all for your questions.